Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Angela Kelly. I am your moderator for this third panel of what has been just a terrific day of conversation. My thanks to the organizers of this terrific conference. I'm a longtime immigration advocate at Open Society Foundations. I'm currently on leave at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. This panel is entitled Politics, Power, and Strategy, The Path Forward. And the key task for us is to build a bridge between some of the hard realities that we heard about this morning with respect to the nativist backlash and the proactive, progressive visions that we discussed earlier this afternoon. How do we get from here to there? How do we build the power needed to change the direction of immigration policy, the political power, the worker power, and the narrative power? The speakers will explore different dimensions of the strategy needed to build this bridge between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Let me introduce your panel of speakers. First is Deepak Bhargava, known to all of us. He is now a distinguished lecturer of urban studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. He's also a co-organizer of this conference. For 16 years before that, he led Community Change, where he played a key role in supporting community organizing in the US, developing new strategies to address poverty, and he played a key role in the growth of the immigrant rights movement here in the US. Good to see you again, Deepak. Following Deepak will be Dee Taylor. Dee is the international president of what has become one of the fastest growing unions in the United States, Unite Here. He is also an organizing expert with a track record of results spanning nearly 40 years in the labor movement. He played a crucial role in building the Culinary Workers Local 226, which has become a powerhouse in politics in the state and has delivered huge gains for the standard of living for workers. Following Dee will be Ruth Milkman. Ruth teaches at SLU and with the CUNY Graduate Center. She's a co-organizer of this conference as well. Thank you very much, Ruth. She writes on a variety of topics. Her books include The LA Story, Immigrant Workers and the Future of the Labor Movement, and the forthcoming Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, which will be out later this month. Next will be Javier Valdez. Javier, as we all know, is the co-director of Make the Road New York and Make the Road Action. Most recently, he led Make the Road New York's organizing team in securing historic victories for immigrants and tenant New Yorkers, including the NYS DREAM Act and restoration of driver's licenses for all. Make the Road is widely recognized as a leading innovator in grassroots worker and community organizing, both in politics and policy in New York and nationally. Make the Road has been at the heart of the response to the coronavirus crisis here in New York City. Finally, last but not least, is Lorella Praley. She's the president of the Community Change Action. They've changed their name recently, and the vice president of Community Change. Lorella is passionate about building collective power to win transformative policy changes at all levels of government so that people can thrive. Most recently, she was at the ACLU as their deputy national political director, where she fought to defend and expand the rights of immigrants and refugees. Before joining the ACLU, Lorella mobilized the Latinx vote as Hillary Clinton's National Latino Voter Director. All right, I'm going to turn it over then to our first speaker, Deepak.
Thanks, Angie. It's really great to be with everyone today. So we often face a gap between our aspirations for the world as it should be and the hard realities of the world as it is. Nowhere is that gap more evident or consequential than with immigration policy. Moral claims about the inherent and equal worth of all human beings are undeniable, but they run up against the realities of public opinion. So how do we navigate that gap? We need a leap of strategic imagination to bridge the distance between our vision and our power. Because the issue of immigration is successfully used by demagogues as a wedge to stir racialized resentment, solving this puzzle is the linchpin for the success of the whole social justice agenda. Without a good strategy for immigration, we will lose on immigration, but we will also lose on everything else. The stakes are really high. So here are the dimensions of our predicament. The right wing was once divided between a pro-immigration corporate bloc and a nativist wing. That right has now united behind an ethno-nationalist politics as its core agenda. This coalition is formidable, and the Trump victory in 2016 showed its power. The alternatives from the center and the left so far are unworkable politically, morally unacceptable, or both. So the center-left comprehensive immigration reform approach has been weakened by defections from both the left and the right. Meanwhile, some liberals in the US and around the world have kind of thrown up their hands and argued that we must stop welcoming immigrants to, quote unquote, save democracy. This is morally wrong and tactically dumb. On the other hand, the open borders framework, which has become popular on the far left in the US, while I share its intentions, actually has had the unintended effect of reinforcing the strength of the nativist politics it seeks to combat. So neither approach does immigrants any favors. So what's the alternative to nativist nationalism? The person who most clearly points the way to a new strategy for the left is, of all people, Stephen Miller, architect of Trump's nativist onslaught. Now, morally, there is nothing to admire in what Stephen Miller has done. Strategically, though, he has masterfully used the levers of power to try and prolong the rule of a nativist white minority bloc and to suppress the emergence of a multiracial progressive majority. There's been a cold, calculating logic underneath the hate. The backdrop of all this, of course, is the massive growth in immigration, significantly from Latin America and Asia, that followed passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. Now, many have taken the browning of America, the demographic revolution, which will turn America into a majority of color nation, to be inevitable. But the policies of the Trump administration have brought the continuous growth in migration since 1965 to nearly a screeching halt. Net migration decreased by 70% in 2018 from just 1 year before. Trump's restrictions on immigration are having their desired effect. Not only the policy, but the incitement to hatred has discouraged migration by sending a chilling message to prospective migrants. Millions of Indian parents, for example, heard the message delivered by a gunman who killed Indian workers in Kansas. Do not send your kids to America, it's not safe. The white supremacist ideology behind these policies is well documented by leaked emails from Miller himself. So bear with me and think of Miller as a frog trying to cross a lake to a destination in which white power is preserved. But he can't hop to his promised land in one giant leap by openly declaring a desire for a white nationalist republic. So the public argument has been about, quote unquote, protecting American workers, a frame that's designed to provide an umbrella for people who are uncomfortable with explicit racism to stand beneath. Meanwhile, he's been hopping from lily pad to lily pad, and each policy success has had feedback effects that weaken us and strengthen the nativists, making it possible to introduce even more extreme policies into the debate. Each leap normalizes new discourse and practices. Power skillfully exercised creates more power. Now, I suspect that Miller does enjoy the suffering of migrants that his policies have created, but his real agenda is white power. And he's gotten farther across that lake than many would have imagined possible. Now, on the center left, we have been divided in recent years between purists and pragmatists. So leftists accuse liberals of selling out. Liberals accuse leftists of tilting at windmills. Stephen Miller has been our unwanted teacher. He has shown how to keep faith with long-term values and advance them incrementally by using power to build more power. Now, I agree with our colleagues who spoke earlier on an earlier panel that we need to move to a much more generous immigration system. Climate change makes this imperative even more urgent. But public opinion is not there now. To acknowledge this reality, this distance, is not to capitulate to it. We're going to need a strategic perspective that honestly reckons with the realities of public opinion today without abandoning our deepest values. So given this reality, this backdrop, what are we to do? So I believe we can win, and soon. And to do so, the four strategic imperatives for our movement are: first, centrists, liberals, and leftists are going to have to come together in a united front. The basis of that unity is the clear and present danger of white nationalist nativism and our shared interest in defeating it. This danger is only going to seem to have abated if Trump is defeated in 2020. If the last decades taught us anything, it's that nativists are often at their strongest when they seem to be on their knees. So pro-immigrant forces from the center to the left should unite around a few priorities and use power on battles that, if won, will deliver our communities more power. Think of this as Stephen Miller, but hopping in the reverse direction across that lake. So a united front is going to require some painful concessions on all sides. Those of us on the left are going to have to acknowledge that order, control, and limits are, given the state of public opinion, necessary to achieve the reforms that will build power over the long term. The reward will be far greater power for immigrants themselves to set the terms of the debate. Centrists and liberals, on the other hand, are going to have to end complicity with a never-ending spiral of immigration enforcement. Beyond the human toll of such policies, it's clear that no amount of concessions on enforcement will bring Republicans to the table. Only a series of repeated and crushing defeats will bring them to the table. Second, this united front is going to have to focus its limited leverage on a few non-reformist reforms that permanently alter the balance of power between pro-immigrant and nativist forces in the country. So we should use our limited leverage after the election to win changes that would have big feedback effects by enabling immigrants to feel more powerful and to be more powerful. The top priority is to reduce fear of detention, deportation, and participation in civic life. This fear inhibits organizing. Immigrants will mobilize when the threat of immigration enforcement has been reduced by bold executive action like a moratorium on deportations and by budget cuts that eviscerate the deportation machine. We also have to use the full range of executive powers, including TPS, deferred action, to protect immigrants. That will create greater security and give US citizen family members of immigrants a reason to mobilize in 2022 and 2024. We also need to move to legalize and naturalize as many people as possible. That means making naturalization easier and cheaper and creating more political power for immigrants. I'll talk a little bit about, in questions and answers later, about if an opening comes for legislation, how we might think about walking through that. But two other last quick points. We have to, the third key priority is the political mobilization of immigrants. And I'll leave this to Dee and just say that in some ways our biggest asset in the US compared to every other nation in the world facing nativism is that we have electoral leverage by virtue of our numbers, but that leverage won't translate into power by magic. It requires skilled organizing. Lastly, immigrant rights has to be rerouted in the broader struggle for economic and social justice in the country. When this crisis can be the moment when immigrant workers unite with other workers to challenge the economic oligarchy that has been laid bare by the crisis. And that mass organizing will provide a springboard for the solidarity that clears the path for immigration reform. So doing all this is going to require a lot of discipline, unity, and savvy. But I think if movement leaders are willing to make some hard choices about how to focus the power of immigrants and this broader coalition, there's every reason to be optimistic that the ugly croaking of Stephen Miller and his friends will soon be reduced to a whisper and that the future will be ours. Thanks, and it's my pleasure to turn this over to our good friend and leader, Dee Taylor.
Oh, you're on mute. I'm I'm not sure who decided this lineup, but it's not really fair to follow you, Deepak, so I appreciate it. I really have a strong feeling that we have to make change bottom up and spread out throughout our country. When I first came to Nevada in the 80s, Nevada was called the Mississippi of the West. And it was a cowboy town in every way possible. It was completely controlled by a few families. And I'm not talking about mafia. Wall Street had taken over. But it was a very us and them town. And part of us was a large workers from all over, essentially Latin America. People don't know, actually, Las Vegas was the second largest relocation center for Cubans after the Fidel. So it was a weird mix. So we decided in the union movement that we were going to fight for all workers, and those workers were going to be black, brown, yellow, white, didn't care purple. We were always in a fight there. And back in the 90s, we started building a union that was a real rank and file union. In fact, the leaders that we were really organizing looked a lot different than the people who used to run the union. A lot of people used to run the union just look like me. But we organized the immigrant workers who essentially were in the kitchens or in the housekeeping, and they became the leaders. And they finally had a voice. And so we decided first we had to build the union up. And that came through a lot of struggles, including a 6-year, 4-month, and 10-day strike without one single scab. But in building that, we said we had to move into the political front too. So back in the 90s, we knew if we started talking to people about politics, devoid of the union, that wouldn't work, because most of our members, just like it's no different than today, are very distrustful of the politicians, and frankly didn't think that they were going to deliver for them. So we always tied our political work in with the union work. So our first big race was in 96 against a state senator who also owned a casino, who was fighting us, and we defeated her. She was the only incumbent. And that was in a district that was a heavily immigrant district that she would pay lip service to, but we organized from the bottom up. It was a tremendous victory. And then we kept on progressing. But what really sort of turned the switch for us was after 9/11, for us old enough to remember all that, the backlash against quote unquote foreigners, against immigrants. And so our union, spearheaded up by the former president, John Wilhelm, and also by Maria Elena Durazo, who was head of our local in Los Angeles, came up with the idea of the Immigrant Workers Freedom Ride, where we had all these freedom rides, and we copied the civil rights movement. I was very familiar with that, being from the South originally myself, to descend upon New York. And I remember what we did there was to declare we're not going to be afraid. We are what make this country work. And we took it head on. And then obviously we kept on making political gains. And then we decided in 2011, we were sick and tired of Sheriff Arpaio. Now, Arizona is a crazy ass state. I thought Nevada was crazy. Nothing like Arizona. I mean, I've dealt with militia folks. I've dealt with crazies, but Arpaio was a symbol that we felt we had to take down. And Arizona reminded me a lot of when I lived in California in the early 80s, where there was a huge disconnect between the voting population and who actually worked and lived there. And we wanted to change that disconnect. So we sort of made Arpaio our Pete Wilson. And we organized, I remember we registered 35,000 people in Phoenix, and they were mainly very young Latinos. And our volunteers often were 13 or 14-year-olds who were documented in this country, and their parents weren't, and they wanted to make a fundamental change. So The 2012 Arpaio campaign, we lost, but in fact, we won. And then from there, we've done diligent work in Nevada. Nevada has now become a completely blue state. We were the first union in the country to endorse Obama. I remember that was very tough. There was a big divide between our African American members, our white members, and our heavily immigrant workers. They were not so sure on that, but that was brought along together. We understood together we always do better than separate. We accelerated that in 16. We were the only targeted state that went blue for Clinton. We elected the first Latina to the U.S. Senate in Catherine Cortez Masto. We changed the legislature to all blue. In 18, we elected another woman, Jackie Rosen, who beat a Republican who had never lost any election in his lifetime. And we elected a governor. Now, often you say, well, politics don't matter. For the first time, we got collective bargaining. We took on pharma. We were the first state in the country I would love to have had price regulation on pharmaceutical drugs, but you can't do that. So we did all this transparency. The Innocence Project, heavily involved. So we have actually reform in Nevada, which you would not expect in the Mississippi of the West of a few years ago. We have been heavily involved with the TPS fight. When Trump went after TPS, we'd go to Congress and most of the congressional people go, oh, DACA. We go, no, TPS. We really had to educate them. We have a huge number of members who are Haitian, particularly in Florida. We have a lot of Salvadoranians, et cetera. People I know quite closely for years who've had kids here, established, as we call it, the American dream. And we just decided to take this on. It took us a while. We built a great coalition, both in the labor movement and obviously a lot of groups who were on this panel to change this discussion on TPS. Obviously, I think what Deepak said is exactly right. I must tell you, I don't want to throw out the good for the perfect. I think absolutely immigration reform. We have to defeat people in order to get people to understand this. If you remember after 2012, I will never forget this. I turned on Fox News because I like to watch the enemy. And even those jerks like Sean Hannity, et cetera, says, well, maybe we have to reconsider our immigration policy because Obama won in many parts of the country based on this new pool of workers. Well, somehow or another, we thought by something that would happen in Congress that things would change. I think we have to go into states and congressional districts and from the bottom up, organize immigrant workers and their kids who so much need to have a fair shake, who deserve to have a fair shake, who are the future, along with, frankly, this huge group of working class people of all colors that really want to have a say. So I want to emphasize one thing what Deepak said. If you've ever read about horrible policies that have occurred in countries, they never happen like that. It's incremental. And we have to turn back the clock. That will not happen by words. That will happen by, I think, helping the unions organize and fight for worker rights, and in changing the politics on the local level up and up and up. I lived in California in the early 80s. California now, oh, that's a blue state. California, no Democrat could ever win in California. So it can be done. We got to do it from the bottom up. We have to do it with workers. We have to do it to make it relevant to their day-to-day life. I really feel honored to be on this panel. This is sort of above my pay grade. One of the people I'd like to introduce, who I remember long ago in working in Las Vegas when I used to live there all the time. She's a tremendous, I'm so glad I'm able to introduce Ruth Milkman.
Thank you, Dee. Can you hear me? Thank you, Dee. It's great to be on this panel with you and Deepak and Javier and, well, everyone. I'm going to switch topics a little bit. from the ground war, if you like, what Dee was just talking about, which I completely agree is absolutely imperative, building power for workers on the ground, fighting the good fight to win more political power for pro-immigrant forces. I agree with all of that, but since I just have my 10 minutes here, I'm going to talk about something else, which is an effort to craft a counter-narrative challenging, if you like, the status quo narrative, the Trump narrative, what many call the immigrant threat narrative. For those of you who were with us this morning, another way to think about what I'm going to try to do is that it's an effort to meet the challenge Ryan Sensor highlighted this morning. He emphasized that public opinion is actually not really with us on this issue. And another panelist this morning, Justin Guest, talked about the specific challenge regarding the white working class. So what I'm going to try to do is outline some arguments from the book that Angie mentioned when she introduced the panel. It's will be out this summer, and it's called, well, let me show you the cover. The book has all the gory details, and they are gory. For example, there's a detailed account of the history of the meatpacking industry, which is, of course, in the news again now. I'll just try to outline the basics for you. The immigrant threat narrative long precedes Donald Trump's rise, but it's been around for quite a while and building up incrementally, if you like, as Dee suggested. But it has been greatly amplified by Trump and also Stephen Miller, as Deepak mentioned earlier, since 2016. And that narrative constructs immigrants, especially low-wage immigrant workers of color, as a threat to U.S. workers, as a threat also to state and local treasuries and to public safety, although I'm going to focus on the labor market part. This narrative blames low-wage immigrants for the degraded pay and conditions of U.S.-born workers, especially non-college educated workers in recent decades. What I try to document in the book is the following. These workers, US-born workers, have every reason to be enraged, but their anger is misdirected. It should be directed at employers and other elite players in the United States, not at immigrants. Those workers have every right to be angry at employers who have undermined their unions, cut their health care and pension benefits, and otherwise degraded what were once decently paid jobs. They should also be angry at the elites who have deregulated the economy and crafted other public policies that have widened income inequalities between the haves and the have-nots. So I'm arguing that our challenge as progressive advocates of humane immigration policy is to educate those workers and the wider public about the actual history, the actual sequence of events that have led to the deterioration of jobs and to widening inequality. So I want to talk about that in sort of two steps, because it's a kind of gendered story. One part of the story involves employer attacks on unions, wage suppression, health and pension cuts, deteriorating working conditions, and the elimination of job security in many, many industries, including, for example, residential construction, trucking, meat packing, I already mentioned. All of those industries used to employ US-born workers, actually mostly white US-born workers, non-college educated workers. And as the jobs were degraded in each of those cases and a few others, what happened was that US-born workers chose to leave these jobs, which were no longer attractive jobs. And subsequent to that, employers turned to immigrants. And I think it's just really important to be clear on the sequence of events there. So that's one version of the story. I want to read you an example of the dynamic, which actually comes from not from blue collar jobs, but from teaching, which was reported recently in the New York Times prior to in 2018 this was. This is a quote from the article. The latest wave of foreign workers sweeping into American jobs brought Donato Soberano from the Philippines to Arizona. He had to pay thousands of dollars to a job broker and lived for a time in an apartment with 5 other Filipino workers. The lure is the pay, 10 times more than what he made doing the same work back home. Mr. Soberano is not a hospitality worker or a home health aide. He's in another line of work that increasingly pays too little to attract enough Americans. Mr. Soberano is a public school teacher. School districts can't find enough American educators willing to work for the pay that's offered. This was in early 2018, shortly before the big wave of teacher strikes, which of course were provoked by this exact situation of deteriorating pay and conditions for teachers. So this is a minor thing. Teaching has not turned into an immigrant occupation, obviously. It's, but that's the dynamic that I'm talking about. And in other industries, it got to the point where the industries completely transformed their labor force from US-born to foreign-born workers. So as I mentioned, there's sort of a separate dynamic, which mostly involves women workers, and it's slightly different, which is involving female-dominated service jobs and domestic work, home care, things like that. And there, the dynamic is driven by growing inequality and by new opportunities for African Americans and other workers of color who were born in the United States. So as inequality has grown since the mid-1970s, which as you all know, it's exploded in those decades, we've seen a couple of different things happen. One is increased demand by people who benefit from growing inequality, the haves, for various kinds of personal services, everything from nail salons, which have exploded, to paid domestic labor, which they might have done that work on their own prior to the growth of inequality. And of course, another contributing factor is growing participation by women in the economy and the aging of the population and so on. So that's one dynamic, increasing demand for various kinds of personal and domestic services. And then around the exact same time, the success of the civil rights movement actually greatly expanded opportunities for African American and US-born women of color who had been doing domestic work. So they exited those jobs. It's different from the story I told you about the men in that these were never great jobs. They were always degraded. It's different that way. But the story is the same in that US-born workers left, and then employers, they were replaced by immigrants. Employers, in this case, households, shifted to immigrant workers. So the basic claim here is that immigrant employment in low-wage jobs is the result, not the cause, of labor degradation and growing inequality. And again, that the anger of US-born workers that we heard about this morning about that outcome is completely justified, but also completely misdirected. So I will just stop there. Thank you. And I want to turn it over now to Javier Valdez from Make the Road New York.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for having me today and for giving me the opportunity to speak about an organization I deeply care and admire. My name is Javier Valdez. I'm the co-executive director of Make the Road New York. Sorry, let me get this going. So Make the Road New York is an organization that builds to power immigrant and working class communities to achieve dignity and justice. As we have this conference, we are going through one of the most horrendous pandemics that is facing our country. We clearly know that the coronavirus does not discriminate against people, but does government policies actually do discriminate against us. And those government policies have resulted in Black and Brown communities being impacted the most. As we have this conversation, I just want to pay tribute to all the members of Make the Road that we've lost to the pandemic during this time. Make the Road New York has been able to survive through these difficult moments by supporting each other. And it's been, we lost 42 souls to this pandemic. But one of the things that really lifts me up in the work that we do today is that today, on May Day, an important day to the immigrant rights community, we're back on the streets of Manhattan doing a caravan for the excluded workers that are not part of the federal package and calling action towards them in memory of those that we've lost. I just want to show a very short clip of an action that we did in Times Square just 3 hours ago. This action, again, was a tribute to our membership for those that we have lost, but to really call for our government to step up and do something that calls for the recovery for all. So who are we and what do we do? One of the things that I really want to stress today is that how important it is to build at the very local level in order for us to be able to achieve national change. So Make the Road New York has been around since 1997. We operate community centers in 5 geographies across New York State. We have over 24,000 dues-paying members, and then we also have sister organizations across the United States. We take action, we take collective action, and some of the pictures that you're able to see here today demonstrate that. So where are we located? We're in Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, Long Island, and Westchester. We have made a critical decision as an institution that we have to go and build in the suburban context as well. And we have sister organizations, as I mentioned, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Connecticut. Before I kind of explain the couple of work that we do, I want you all to understand what it means to actually build a very democratic, participatory organization. We believe in a high touch model. We think that it's important for us to be able to engage with people. So on average, 800 people attend our issue committee meetings each week. Notwithstanding, we have about 400 people that come in through our doors on a weekly basis seeking our services. Each of those issue committee leaders has a team that drives, has a leadership team that drives the community campaigns, the recruitment, the strategy, in order for us to be able to move the work forward. We've been able to graduate over 300 people that have done a 6-week intensive leadership development school program last year. So this is something that we're deeply invested in. And annually, we bring together 30 leaders from each of the Make the Roads in order for us to really think through our national structure. Again, really honing in that it's critically important for us to be able to, in order to build for the long run, really have deep roots in our communities and support those there. Just to put in perspective, who's the leadership of our institution? Of our 21 board members, 13 of them are members of our organization, elected by the members. So they have the majority of the votes. Here's some pictures of some of the work that we've been able to do across the organization through all these years. So what is our theory of change? And what is it that we can actually add to the movement? Excuse me. We at Make the Road, we aspire to plant the seeds of collective liberation. On a day-to-day basis, we integrate community organizing, transformative education, high-quality services, and policy innovation. We create a community of support that is in solidarity by engaging people as whole human beings and providing a vibrant community space that enables individuals to dream, to create, to collectively experience healing, to laugh, to comfort, and to make deep connections with other human beings, but more important, to understand that their purpose is larger than themselves. By creating this vehicle, community members are able to analyze the problems that they face, elevate their voices, and cultivate skills to collectively identify and implement solutions. We deeply agree that we have to be able to collaborate with labor, with community, with faith-based allies to be able to, what Martin Luther King said, generate movements, and movement strength. Why we do all this? We want to be able to build sustainable democratic membership organizations that unite all members, regardless of working class, immigration communities, across generations, national identities, gender, and sexual orientation, and really builds the leadership from the ground up. We want to develop and maintain deep roots in local geographic communities while simultaneously engaging policy and program work at the city, state, and federal level. And we think that we've been able to do that and do that well. One thing that I want to be able to talk to you is why we in the left have to make sure that we're building at the state and local level. We have fought for many years, along with many of the allies that you heard today, for federal reform, especially a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented immigrants. And we fought tooth and nail to rein in that out-of-control enforcement machine that has done so much damage to our communities. And we will continue to fighting to the bitter end. But my point today is that we cannot surrender the states. And our opponents have seen that that's very critical. They know that building at the state and local level can actually create critical energy in order for them to build nationally. We cannot see that space. First, we can and we must win enormously important protections at the state level and local level for our people that keep them safe. I know that there's a difference between some states, such as New York, to other states, but in the states that we have to move the ball forward and try to create the level of protections that we need. Moreover, local and state fights are critical in engaging people where they are. You foster their political education, you get them ready to be part of some broader policy fights. You meet them where they are and you get them activated. Third, the fight in the states and cities have a major impact on the conversation around the country on immigration. We've seen that when we are able to win on critical issues of immigration, it does have a national impact in the conversation that we're able to do. And then, as we know this because of what happened in Arizona, Dee mentioned that a little bit with Arizona SB 1070 and similar anti-immigrant pushes across other states. We need to be a movement that is focused on building infrastructure in many places where there's none or too little. And that's why we expanded to states such as Pennsylvania. And that's what we're trying to collaborate with as many people here. Deepak mentioned something that was critical, and it's why we need to also be able to build political leverage. And that's something that Make the Road New York has taken seriously. We have been able to door knock on over 200,000 doors over the last year. And this year, if we're able, we're going to be able to door knock on over 700,000 doors across 5 states. Why are we doing this? Because we, as Deepak has said, we think we have the political leverage to be able to win substantial victories, primarily in the suburbs. This slide shows to you that Make the Road New York and their allies, when they were able to go to Long Island, were able to generate critical victories that enable us to win. And it's because we were the margin of that victory and getting our communities to vote. So building at the local state power, it takes time, it's critical. Not losing sight of the political leverage that we have and have the victories that we're able to win. I end by just sharing that we have been successful. We have had some tremendous victories here in New York State. Here's a montage of some of the victories that we've had over the last 4 years that protect the communities across our state. So this is a fight that is long overdue. This is a fight that we can win, but we need to make sure that we as a movement are engaging at the very local and state level. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it to my movement sister, Lorela.
Thank you, Javier. I'm sending you much love from Connecticut to New York. I know how hard this is for our country, but also how hard it is for New Yorkers and for Make the Road and its members. I wanted to start with a quick reflection, and that is that one of my fondest memories before coming out as undocumented and unafraid was walking into a room of 150 young and proud undocumented people who had gathered in Kentucky to decide on the strategy to push for the 2010 DREAM Act. I met my sister, Cristina Jimenez, who you heard speak on the previous panel right there. And a series of choices brought us together in that moment. One, we had made a decision to build state and local presence, to find more people like ourselves, to agitate them, and to build with them, and a commitment to really building a powerful national network of undocumented young people known as United We Dream. Two, we had made a decision to pivot from comprehensive immigration reform to the DREAM Act. And three, perhaps most importantly, every single person in that room had made a decision to step out of the shadows and into the light, determined to have a say and to lead the fight that would deliver on much needed relief. I start here because we're talking about strategy, which is really a matter of focus and choice. And because we have been there, because we know how to do that, but it has been a long time since we've been on the offense at the federal level. We have in the past been able to both hold the ability to imagine and to make strategic choices along the way. These choices in 2010 was to go from CIR to DACA, in 2014 from a legislative campaign to win CIR, to a campaign focused on President Obama, which led to the announcement of Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, also known as DAPA. And as we prepare for either a second term of Trump or a Biden administration, we will have to make choices again. And, I want to say that I really reject the argument that suggests that focus and choice means that we're settling for less, because I believe it is our responsibility to articulate our vision for the future and to campaign to win in the present. So really, I'm going to keep this short because I believe we have to get back to our fundamentals. We have to get back to really building the power of the people. It is my belief that the fights to achieve justice must be championed by those closest to the pain, because they are the closest to the solution. And doing so begins to make the impossible or the perceived impossible possible. And I also believe that we have only scratched the surface in terms of what is possible when we talk about organizing people. And that this particular moment, this moment of crisis and devastation, of pain, that we also have an opening to really shift public consciousness, to move the public imagination on what's possible, to grow our movements, and to really show just how deeply our fates are linked. Second and related, I believe we must live into our truth. Movements don't require legal change first in order to authorize the kind of life that people want to lead. Movements actually don't wait. They build pressure so that the law can drop into place. They anticipate and create the conditions for legal change. This right here is one of the most critical lessons from the immigrant youth movement. The ability to actually enact the role of citizenship before the status has been conferred. We don't need permission to be, but we do need formal recognition to close the gap. What then, my question is, might our possibilities be if the country could really feel the power of the people and our demands? And with this, I believe we must also guard against cynicism and instill a sense of hope and possibility, even as we make hard choices, even as we choose to focus our fights. We must tell the story of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Third, we must be clear about the path forward. That means we must have an assessment of our power. What is the actual power that we have? What of our current predicament is tactical? And what of it is a power deficit? That will allow us to figure out how we close the gap. And fourth, I believe, as you heard Deepak Bhargava say, that we must resituate our issue as part of a broader whole. That the fights and the strategies of the past may not necessarily be the way forward. So we have to think about how to organize our collective power, right? I'm bringing us back to choice and strategy again, in order to make those choices and really set out to win on the things that will make more wins possible for us. And finally, we know that the road ahead is long and arduous, and we are certain that it is also full of hope and possibility if we can tap into the power of our imagination, if we can see what is unseen and build to make it real. There is no single strategy that will deliver the kind of change our country needs. It just doesn't exist, which is why we are committed to finding and charting the path with people. A different future is only possible if we continue to do the important work of transforming lives, of growing our movement, of building narrative power, of rethinking policy framework, and of developing new leaders. And so I want to turn it back to Angie and just close out by saying that it is really in hope, right? Hope is where the future takes root. And if you spend enough time with Javier's members, with the members that make up the membership of our partner organizations in the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, if you spend enough time with those people, it is not a sad story. It is actually a story of resilience and perseverance and focus and of lucha, right? And I say that to wrap up because we spend so much of our time in DC and often in policy fights wrapped up in all of the wrong things. And when we allow ourselves the space and the ability to step out of the day-to-day politics and actually be directly in contact and in touch with the people, we remember that there is actually a path and that we are just on that long arc towards justice. Thank you, Angie.
Thank you, Lorella. This was the coolest panel that I got to moderate of what has been a day of just spectacular speakers and such deep, important conversation. Most of you who've been with us today already know the drill. You can type in your questions, and through the magic of the internet, they're going to pop up in front of me. So please be thinking about your questions. But I like what some of the other moderators have done, which is to really give the panelists a chance to talk among yourselves about any comments or reflections that you have about what each other has said. We'll do that for a minute or two, and then we'll turn to questions. And just for point of reference, we have until about 5 o'clock. So panelists, what would you like to say to one another? Dee, I think you're talking, but you're on mute.
Yeah, I think Javier is right on the money. I appreciate the fact that first he did tribute to those who've been lost in this horrible thing called the coronavirus. But I think Javier is right. We tend to focus in on Washington. I think that's crazy. I think we've got to focus in on the local and state level and go from the bottom up. I mean, as somebody who lived in the South, the civil rights movement didn't come out of Washington. It came out of small towns like Selma or Atlas, Georgia, or places you've never heard of. And that kind of work, and it allowed it to eventually end in Washington, but not to start in Washington. And I think the same thing with immigration, because Lord knows we've all been to Washington, we've all argued the right things, the humane things. I think we got to really think about what Javier said about starting from outside and moving in. And then I really think, Javier, I'm curious if others read or anybody, Deepak, maybe because I just grew up in the South and too much on the civil rights movement. But we've got to figure out how we go into the belly of the beast and take on the most violently anti-immigrants in their home turf and confront the enemy. And if you think about, I mean, maybe I've just too much time in the South. They didn't go and do, freedom rides up in upstate New York. They went, to Mississippi. They went to Alabama. Obviously, Dr. King spent a lot of time in Chicago, which revealed another type of racism. But I really think we've got to bring drama and conflict. And that's easy to say, but I worry about us just talking to each other and talking about Washington. And I don't think the solution comes out of DC. So I like what you said, Javier, a lot.
Appreciate that.
Javier, you would like to comment on that?
No, Thank you, Dee, for that. It's something that I deeply believe in. I think that people in the panel deeply believe in. The reason that we were able to kind of build in the suburban context was because in conversations that we were having with DPAC and funders, we're saying like we're leaving votes on the table, things that we can actually win. Like just in Dee mentioned how they were able to turn California, how they were able to turn Nevada. In Long Island, in particular, the suburban context in New York, people forget that that's where the Tea Party actually started. And we had 9 Republican state senators 12 years ago when we started work there. And now 6 out of the 9 are Democrats. 3 out of those 6 are people of color. 3 of them are immigrants. So like there's an opportunity there, right? Like we still have way more work to do. They're not all great legislators and we still have to move them to be better on our issues. But we're moving the work forward because we did not cede space. And I think that's something that sometimes we forget, primarily in the suburban context, where I think where we can be more powerful players.
Yeah, this is Deepak. Okay, Ruth, please go first.
Whatever. Sorry.
Go Ruth and Deepak.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I too agree that the state and local stuff is extremely important. And it's kind of ironic, but under Trump, we've actually seen quite a lot of progress here in New York on the state level, driver's licenses for immigrants, full representation by lawyers in immigration proceedings. You know, it sort of doesn't make sense on some level, but I think it's a testimony to the power of what Javier was arguing. On the other hand, I don't think we can neglect the federal level because after all, immigration law is federal law. And, you know, if we're really going to fix things, ultimately, we got to deal with that. And, you know, that's the challenge we're all up against. So, but I don't think it's either or. It's both and. We have to win, we have to do everything right. That's how it works in this country, right? Progressives never win unless we check every box. So, and I just wanted to make one other comment on something Deepak mentioned. It was a very minor point in his excellent talk, but when you were talking about the Republican Party, it's true that the Trump people have captured it and the Stephen Miller line has been the dominant one. But I actually think that, and we saw this just recently when they tried using the pandemic as a cover to block immigration completely. And then there was this hue and cry from the employers. Employers love immigrants, for better or worse, especially in agriculture, restaurants, industries like that. And I think there's a wing in the Republican Party, it's very quiet right now, that does want immigration reform. And I don't know what that means politically in terms of how we leverage that, but it's just interesting to observe.
Yeah, I was going to go in a similar kind of direction in a way. So first of all, I just wanted to say that I was so moved by the pictures of the Make the Road members marching, protesting in Times Square. And I feel like for those of us living in New York, injustice is so palpable, the inequity is so outrageous that I'm just inspired by the leadership and courage that they are showing and the path that they're leading for the rest of us. I think one of the questions we face as a movement is the left-right coalition that's dominated thinking about immigration really broken? And do we need a worker first, multiracial, bottom-up, class, race-conscious movement to be driving forward? And I obviously think the answer is yes, because I think what's happened is the employers, every time the chips have been down between standing up for immigrants in public policy or getting their tax cuts or their deregulation or whatever else they've wanted, they've gone that path. That's always been the higher priority for them. So I'm not persuaded that even if Trump is defeated this year, that the Republican Party will come back to the table, maybe, but their nativist core, that bargain is running pretty deep. And I think the alternative has to be a workers' movement that confronts corporate power. And if not now, in this moment of vast inequity, I'm not sure when it would be possible in our lifetime.
Lorella, you want to jump in here, just kind of given where you sit at community change and the sorts of issues and approaches that I know you take in your work?
Mm-hmm. I would say this is the latest provocation that we're really trying to grapple with. we haven't, like, in a serious way, really tested our power. And we haven't tested our power because we have been fighting within the four corners, usually, of a legislative fight. And it's limited our ability to get creative and to really identify the villains in the story in order to really figure out on which terrains do we want to have this fight, right? And so even in this moment where immigrant workers are essential, they are making sure that we are fed, they are taking care of people all across the board, right? They are the essential workers we're talking about. And even in this moment, right, we are having to move heaven and earth for both Democrats and Republicans. Like, I'm not going to avoid saying Democrats because the fight's also with them, to actually wage a fight to ensure that immigrants are included in the stimulus relief efforts coming out of DC. And so you have to ask, like, we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that this is still the case in a moment of crisis when our contribution and our presence and our role in this country is so clear? It's indisputable, right? It's not even a debate that we should be having. It is not a case we should be having to make. And yet here we are. And so I think that the next phase of our movement, like, I'm in complete agreement with Deepak, right? That the next phase of our movement, like, we have to resituate it, right? That it's not just about immigrant and the immigrant identity, but it's actually about ensuring that our people see themselves as whole, right? Like, this has been, like, I've not tested any of this, but in my own, my own growth and my own trajectory as someone who was undocumented and then became a US citizen, and in my reflections from the time when I was undocumented, my mom didn't first identify as someone who was undocumented. Like, there was a time, and I think it's still very powerful to identify as such, but she was a worker, she was a housekeeper, she was a woman, right? And so in some ways, we can do both, but we can remind people of their power as workers in our country. And I believe that the fights that await in the future that we will help to forge, right, will tell a very different story when we're able to do so. And actually, I think at the local level, like, Javier, you should speak about, the organizing that's happened in New York by really taking on Amazon and other corporations in the state. And so in a lot of ways, actually, those of us who work at the national level have a lot to learn from some of the things that are already being tested on the ground.
Lorella, I think that you're able to see the questions coming in from the audience, because it was basically exactly the last thing that you threw at Javier, which is that people are very excited by this conversation, guys. This is terrific. And they really want to know kind of, how do we get more concrete? Like, what is it on how do you build at the local level? Javier, Dee, others, like, what have you done? Have you been unseating incumbents? How have you gotten people engaged? So people want to dig deep, folks.
Yeah, I think one thing that has been made clear to me from when I started doing this work 22 years ago to where I'm now is, like, there's been a huge shift in our movement where we were trying to persuade those more powerful to be kind to us, to be nice to us, and carry our water. And so now where I think we're, like, part of my language is, like, we can't just put up with that bullshit anymore, and we got to actually put our own people in power. I think you've seen the immigrant rights movement transform over the last 10 years, where there's new leadership and the people that are closest to the pain are leading the movement. And I think that's something that needs to continue. And we've been able to put our folks into power, into positions of power. So that takes some time. It's not overnight. But now, like, when they're in power, we're still pushing them, even though they're our friends. They're now our new target, but it's a new target that you can work with differently. And with that, we've been able to succeed, like we've been able to do here in New York with driver's license, the DREAM Act, the representation, et cetera. So I think that's one clear thing. And to the question about corporate power, to, like, one issue that Ruth mentioned, like, I do think that corporations do like immigrant, but they like immigrant labor, not so much immigrants themselves, right? It's the labor that they like, with no real support for them in their whole being. And I think a lot of corporations are willing to profit off our pain. And that's why we launched the Backers of Hate campaign here in New York with our allies nationally, was because there were so many people that saw the Trump regime as an opportunity to make a shitload of money out of our pain. And that was very, very clear. They saw that detention centers was a very profitable thing. And that's why we wanted to call them out for that hypocrisy. And being able to do that here in New York, we did that in Delaware, in California, and across the nation, allowed for us to really dent the ability for them to have the finances necessary to operate these horrendous cages that they do. So I think that's something that we all gotta be mindful of. Is it's like, we need to stop saying, can you please do this for me? We gotta push, we gotta fight, and we gotta get into power.
Great. Dee, would you want to get in here? You're on mute if you do want to. You've talked about, no, there you go.
Yeah. Oh,
you could just piggyback on, and then also just tell us, like, because you described incredible work in Arizona, in Nevada, obviously in California. And so, like, what are some of the next frontiers, recognizing that we're in a massive crisis right now, but move us forward in that kind of, this is where we're going to go next kind of way.
Well, I'm going to have us go backward first into history.
Okay.
What Ruth said was absolutely true. In America, we've always hated the last people off the boat. That's just the American history. It is. And I don't know why we deny that. And the only way the immigrants previously got a voice, one of the biggest vehicles, was the union movement. I mean, that's how the Irish, the Italian, the Jewish finally got a movement. Now, the labor movement is, no different than any other. It's sort of a reflection of America. We have some unions that understand the future is with immigrants in large part, depending on where you are in the country. But the great thing about the union movement, economics unites people. Everybody knows the boss is screwing them. And if you can get through that, then you can start moving people on a social level too, which is important. I mean, the local here in Las Vegas, this was not an immigrant union when we started. This was predominantly white and African American. Now, over time, it has changed. And we always said, guys, your fate is tied together. You're not going to get something better if you divide each other up. That's a boss's tool. So I really do think that the groundwork we need to do politically is, I always say this, politicians always forget who's electing them. They always remember who defeats them. And I think we have to go after Democrats and Republicans. I don't discriminate there. I'd rather primary a Democrat who's a piece of garbage, who gives us lip service around election time and forgets our name the day after, and really focus in on that. So I think that that's important. But we got to get out of where we're comfortable. Mm-hmm. I keep on talking about the South. In our union, I say, if we change the South, we change America, because the South has come to us. Whoever thought right to work would be in Michigan? None of us, right? Whoever thought that you'd have those crazies in Michigan doing what they did the other day? So if we don't go to the South, it comes to us. And I think that I'm going to point out one state that used to be a pretty progressive for a Southern state. The Koch brothers took it over, and now it'd be unbelievable. North Carolina. We should go to North Carolina. North Carolina has the fastest growing Latino population in America, percentage-wise. It is right. It is a state that could be turned. It's a state where there is no infrastructure to do that right now. And I think Florida. Florida is ours to take. Florida is 3 different states. You got Miami-Dade in the south, which is completely different than Orlando. And then you go up into really northern Florida, which is southern Georgia. But Central Florida, Kissimmee, which used to be, it has now a Puerto Rican mayor, which you would not have had a Puerto Rican welcomed in that town 20 years ago. But I think Florida and North Carolina are places that we really should look at. And I think the one other state, because I think Stacey Abrams has done so tremendous work in Georgia, we could really build an alliance in Georgia between African Americans, Latinos, and frankly, other immigrants, a huge Indian population there, in fact. We could change those states. You start changing those states, you really start changing America. And we got to go to the South, not avoid it, go there.
I would add, we also have to go to the Rust Belt, the distressed, deindustrialized cities, which, as we know, are also politically quite crucial in November and other times. But I completely agree. These are the most challenging frontiers in a way, and it's hard, but it seems like a critical part of the challenge.
Also, you have to make America decide, white America decide, which side are you on. And I think I have a firm belief in the decency of folks in this country. We tend to focus in on the bad apples. I have a firm belief when stark injustice and hatred comes out, we have to force people to make a decision. And, you don't get public opinion right away. I mean, I love how they've made Dr. King a saint. I grew up in the South. Dr. King was no saint when he died in a lot of people's mind. I mean, he was a controversial figure, but he led us to a better life. I think we've got to really think about not just worrying about public opinion, because I think the public opinion catches up to what's right, not starts out with what's right. And I'll shut up now for a while.
No. That's actually a really good bridge to the next question. Again, people really want to know, how do we make this happen at the state and local level? And so the question is, at the state and local level, progressive movements in progressive states have been empowered by the resistance to the anti-immigrant Trump regime. However, in more conservative states, the anti-immigrant sentiment has been emboldened. How do we combat this in more conservative regions?
Can I say something? I don't have a full answer to that, but one thing that I am remembering as we approach November is how 4 years ago, how many white workers would say that they're for Trump, but if that doesn't work out, they're for Bernie, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. I'm for Sanders, but if that doesn't work out, I'm for Trump. And at the time, it puzzled me deeply, like, well, how could this be? It didn't make any sense. But what I've come to realize is that in both cases, you could call these right and left-wing versions of populism. Our challenge is to shift people to the left-wing version, which is predicated on unity across lines of race and where you were born. And emphasizing what Dee said before, that workers know that they do have common cause against employers, but that has to be lifted up. And I think somebody said this morning in the conference, I think it was May 9, that all this stuff is politically contingent. It's people can be persuaded. And so that is, I think that's just a key part of the challenge, obviously, along with that hard work of on the ground organizing.
Go ahead.
Laura and then Dee.
I would just say that it's like what works in New York, right? Like New York has to keep on pushing, right? New York, California, and other states. And what works there is not necessarily what works in Arkansas, right? So our partner in Arkansas, led by Mireya, is actually has been able to get rid of two 287G agreements, right? And has been able to create a coalition that's broad enough to really make the way and make the case there. And so it really is very state specific when you're fighting at that level, and what works in one place doesn't necessarily carry over to another place. Like you may have to lean more heavily on, like if you have mostly Republicans elected in positions of power, then you have to lean on other strategies. You have to build different kinds of coalitions. You have to do different forms of persuasion, and your audience is different. And so there isn't a cookie cutter answer across the country, but certainly I feel like for the people who are tuning into this and asking, I would start by checking out, go to the firm website and see if there's an organization in your state that you can plug into and try to do the organizing with them, right? Like we can't answer those questions. Like they are already in your state.
I think I really am a firm believer. It's hard to think about now in this crisis of real ground troops, door to door, talking to people. No one talks to people anymore. They get a mailer, they get a text message, they watch something on TV, and you have to listen. I forget which panelist said this. You got to meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many times, because I still walk precinct, where I might have to go back 3 times the same door. And listening to people is a really important thing. And what I found about working class people, they all want the same things. They want to provide for their loved ones. They want to take care. They want their loved one, their kids to have a better future. They want the sort of, the old fashioned thing called the American dream. And I find if you put that layered on with immigrants who don't feel welcome right now in this country in many parts, because this jerk off in the White House, but he's been fed and condoned by all the other Republicans. We have to reach out, and we have to do the hard door-to-door work. I mean, there's nothing sexy about that. There's nothing fancy about it. I mean, how we change, I'm sure others know this, who have done this, it's door-to-door, it's brick by brick, it's community by community. And once you build something like that, it's on pretty solid footing. I mean, I'll never forget walking precinct. This was in 2008, and my wife and I were walking this precinct, and my wife comes back and she goes, the Republicans are screwed. I go, why are you saying that? She goes, I'm hitting a lot of doors here where all these young kids are registered to vote. Their parents can't because of their status. They are so pissed off at the R's. If we could mobilize these folks, we're going to kick their ass. And if we don't go door to door and do that, I actually don't think any text messages are going to do that. I don't think social media in the long run, that might help. No one talks to people anymore and takes the time to listen to them. I can't tell you how valuable, at least I find that, because I learned from them a lot more than they learned from me. I know that. And Lorella's right on the money, man. People have to feel value. And when you take the time to do that, and their opinion counts just as much as you, that's what changes things.
Great. Questions are slowing down a little bit, but I have a few. One is just a shout out to you, Deepak. The image of Steve Miller as a frog is just perfect. So thanks for that. And I have a big pot of boiling water that I work into in my mind. I'm just going to stop there. But you laid out really these kind of 4 components, if you will, about how we become a stronger movement and get to the place that we want to get to. And I wasn't clear on the 4th one, which I think though is really relevant to the moment we're in today. Can you just kind of repeat that again and build it out a little bit, because I think you were running out of time.
Sure. It really was making the point that immigration justice, the immigrant rights movement, needs to see itself and be part of a larger struggle for economic and racial justice in this country. That it can't succeed kind of off on its own as an issue campaign or something like that. That especially now, in a situation where inequality and corporate power and the devastation of this crisis with mass unemployment and huge crisis for millions and millions of families, that there's an imperative and an opportunity to build working people's power across lines of race and immigration status that really can be the springboard to the kind of working class solidarity that I think will power immigration reform. And fear is a very potent thing. I think Ruth talked about kind of the manipulation of fear by elites, and we're not going to address that until there's a broader struggle in which people see themselves as part of, where if you're a tenant facing eviction, if you're an unemployed person needing access to work or benefits while you look for it, if you're an undocumented person looking to naturalize, et cetera, you see yourself in the struggle. And when people feel that, that's going to be crucial. So that is different than hoping that we can get some support from parts of the corporate community to get us over the top. I believe it'll come when there's power from working class people demanding it across not just immigrants and native-born people in the same fights against employers for justice, that we'll see the other transformations happen in our society.
Just want to give the other panelists a chance to comment on what Deepak just said, and then we'll go to another comment and another question to wrap up. But any thoughts on Deepak's?
I would just add that I think organized labor is absolutely critical to building those bridges that Deepak just outlined. And I know Dee's union has done a lot along those lines. It has a large immigrant worker membership. But the truth is, I'll say it, we haven't heard much from the unions about immigration lately under Trump. I mean, it's true that unions are under attack, immigrants are under attack, everybody's, so people are just kind of clinging on by the edge of their fingernails or something. And I understand that, but if we are going to win, and hopefully we'll have somewhat more possibilities in the new year, labor can't be on the sidelines. It has to be central. And I think we've seen historically how much difference that can make. In California, where I used to live in LA, and I watched as the LA County Fed completely transformed California politics by first organizing immigrants into unions, empowering them that way, mobilizing them politically, making sure people who were eligible for naturalization became citizens, making sure those citizens voted. And pretty soon you had this amazing transformation in LA and in the whole state for, as a result. And I think that model is a great one to think about reproducing nationally. And, even with all its wounds, labor still has a lot of resources, more than most movements do. And it's the most diverse, in terms of membership and by race and immigration status of any, organized group you can name. There's just a lot of potential there. So I would just argue that that's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Can I just add, I think one thing to Deepak's opportunity about us building is that we also have to show up for others. And I think that's been a critical missing link in the immigrant rights movement, and particularly as it relates to Black Lives Matter and things around police brutality. We just have not done our fair share, and we have to be able to be there and join them in those critical fights, because they are us. Those are our communities, and we need to be there if we want other folks to show up for us. So we have to be really thinking through that intersectionality of our movements, of our issues, and, be better partners. And I think that's something that we have to grow up a little bit more on.
It's a great point, Javier. Lorella, I wonder if you want to add anything to that in terms of showing up for the other movements. I've heard you say that many times.
I think Javier covered it. I think what I would add is a little different in that, in addition to that, we are still mostly optional. And that sort of fighting for us isn't just a choice that, Democrats on the Hill are making. It is also true of some of our partners in this work in the broader progressive movement ecosystem. And it is also true that many more of them are with us than they were, 4-6 years ago. And so in just thinking about the different presentations today and some of the things that Ryan said early, is our job isn't just to grow this way, right? But to really grow the depth of support, the intensity of the support for our issue. And then to bring it back to this conversation, probably that the solution there and the path forward there lies in what you're presenting and your provocation, Deepak, about the way forward, right? In really getting out of thinking about our issue of we're really insular as a movement, but really getting out and beyond and seeing ourselves as part of a larger or a broader struggle. And only when we do that, and when we treat our people in that way, when we recognize them in their wholeness, in their fullness, as opposed to this one very important part of their identity, will we be able to really untap the potential and the power of our people.
It's great. Thank you, Lorella. Let me just read a few of the comments. Not a question, but a comment regarding the South and organizing. We need people to donate to grassroots organizations doing work on the ground, like Project South, Southerners on New Ground, Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, etc. We also need organizers on this platform to talk about their experiences uplifting, mobilizing, building alliances between Black and Brown folks across intergenerational and racial intersections. They are the experts that can tell you what's happening on the ground in the South. There was a question and then somebody answered it. The question was, how can we reach people when door-to-door is off the table? Someone suggests just make sure that you stand 6 feet away from the door, wear a mask, bring hand sanitizer. If you offer some wipes, I'm sure they'll talk to you. No, I added that. When you canvass, so you show respect in their space. Delivery people do it all the time. So joking aside, obviously the kind of typical canvassing that we're used to seeing is much more challenging right now. And I don't know if the panelists have anything else that they want to add about how to reach folks in this unusual time.
Well, we better figure it out. I mean, if you look at, I was talking to our Florida folks. They had the Florida primary in March. In Dade County, only 15% of the Democrats turned out. Well, you're not going to win Florida with that. So I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out how we reach people in the new way. I have a longer term view. I mean, it's not like door to door is going to be off limits forever. But I think over the next several months, I think it's incumbent for us to be experimental because we're not quite sure how this works. And we have some opportunities to do that. There's some primaries coming up or some elections. Mm-hmm. We should be experimental and try stuff because I think that's going to be, I'd rather experiment and know what works in June, July, August, even September than find out it didn't work in November.
Yeah, I would just add a couple things here. If you are a part of the groups on the ground and at Community Change Action, one of the things that we've been now perfecting over the years is really this relational organizing program that you can be a part of and tap into through your phone. And so, I think it might be a while before we can actually go door-to-door canvassing. And there are tools that are readily available for us to be connected and to maximize to leverage the power of our relationships, right? And so it isn't actually, you grow your networks by reaching out to your contacts, to your own networks, and then they reach out to theirs. And so even though we can't do the door-to-door, there's a way in which we can be extremely connected in this moment, really activating our base and actually growing the number of people who are a part of our fights and who need to turn out in November.
And I would just share from my experience, like from when we started this, we're about to go into week 8 as we have gone offline and Make the Road, is that where we were in those 8 weeks and trying to get Zooms to work and get everybody mute, et cetera, to where we are now, like our community has adapted rather fast. I do want to make sure that people understand that there's a digital divide and that thing is real, but like we are using different methods. Like we're putting all our workshops via Facebook Live. Just today, our actions say average over 8,000 views just from our base alone. So just like there's opportunities and technology that is there for us to get better at. And people are learning. Our abuelos and abuelitas are getting on to Zoom and really engaging and really talking, right? And that's like amazing to see. So that's an opportunity as we know the other barriers that we have.
Javier, that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank this panel. You guys have been absolutely brilliant and fascinating. There's so much food for thought. I want to thank the conference organizers. Javier, I want to honor you and the folks that you've been working on behalf of on May Day of all days. So bless you. And I believe that we are due back at 7 p.m. For a town hall. And I also think it's perfectly okay to engage a little happy hour between then and now. So folks, you can come back with your little vinito si quieres in just a few hours. But I want to thank everyone. And take care.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Thank you.